Machegni. Oh yeah. Machegni uru. Mai en Onagi gi Twak Makende. Twak Makelo DONGRWOK. DONGRWOK mar Onagi. Kokelu kod an aboksan aila. Koya gwenge mag Netherlands. And Onagi Diaspora TV. Kum jogo man Canada. Kum jogo man Spain. Kum jogo man Belgium. Kum jogo man Italy. Kum jogo man USA. Kum jogo man UK. Kum jogo man Germany. 11K. Unun kuno. Kum jogo man Homa Bay. Siaya. Ugenya Siaya, Homa Bay. Karibuni sana Gikisumu. Kawono Twak Libedo Martin Molokre, because we are going to speak English. And we are here with one of our guests that we've been waiting for so much. Actually, today my co-host is not around, so my co-host is going to be Kenneth Nyagilo, all the way from USA. I don't know if Ken, you can take this opportunity to welcome our guest on studio. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Aboksan. Dr. Topanson, thank you very much for taking your time to join us on this live discussion. It is very paramount, and as I said earlier, this is one of the platforms that we use to educate our people on development matters, on policy matters, on all aspects of life, social aspects, socioeconomic aspects that affect us, so that we can be able to make sure that we use the resources we have in our capacity to build our people, to build our societies. So I take this opportunity to welcome you. Please go ahead and introduce yourself, what you do, where you are, where you work, and then we'll move on from there. Thank you.
Yes, well, very good evening. Good evening to you, Kenneth and Aboksan. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be discussing economics with you. My name, of course, Thompson Fontaine. I'm originally from the island of Dominica in the Caribbean, but I'm here currently in the continent of Africa. I worked for many years as an IMF economist in the Africa department. So I worked in several African countries, South Africa, Kenya, also the Francophone countries, Niger, Benin, Mali. So I've been around Africa a bit, Ethiopia. And so I have a very good grasp of this. I'm an economist by training and just love the whole idea of economics. I specialize in two key areas, the area of debt, but also international economics and more specifically currency issues. I'm a currency expert as well as a debt expert. And so I'm able to speak to some of those issues that are confronting Kenya at this time, and not only Kenya, but something you'll see repeated in many of the African countries. I'm currently here in South Sudan as the Deputy Chief of Strategy for an organization called the Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission. That is an organization that was set up by the countries in the region, what we call the IGAD countries, which includes Kenya, Uganda, Sudan, South Sudan, Eritrea, Djibouti, and we are basically monitoring a peace agreement that was signed in 2018. As you know, South Sudan had a very severe civil war, both in 2014 and 2016, that resulted in the deaths of over 500,000 people, led to over 4 million persons being displaced, seeking refuge in neighboring countries. And they're trying to basically bring the country back together after this long suffering in 2016. A peace agreement was signed in 2018, and that's what we are there monitoring. And so, yeah, it's my pleasure to be with you tonight, and I look forward very much to the discussion.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. It's actually an honor to host you here tonight, and thank you for your time also. For someone of your caliber to get time and to speak to people and discuss matters, development and economics that affecting a region, especially Africa as a continent, to be precise. Wow. Let's go direct to the first question, my friend. I don't know how to address you because your titles are too big.
No. Thompson is fine. Thompson works just well. Yeah, absolutely.
Because you know where I come from, the title comes first before the name. So we say,
No, I'm very comfortable with just Thompson. First name is perfect. That works well. That works well.
Thank you so much, Mr. Thompson. Okay. Yeah. Actually, as we look at the factors affecting a country or factors affecting the Africa, the first thing that comes first as vocabulary is the economy of a region. Then we find we have all people who can lend you money, people who can do this for you, people who can give you this for this, whereby that can help you boost your economy. Then here we came by something known as IMF. What is IMF? Can you start from there?
Yeah, sure. That's a good place to start because the IMF has not necessarily a very good reputation here in Africa. It's called the International Monetary Fund. It is one of the institutions that was formed right after the Second World War. The United Nations, we know, was formed in the area of politics to more diplomacy and politics. Well, the IMF was set up along with the World Bank in what was referred to as the Bretton Woods institutions, and it was set up basically to look after the monetary systems of the world. The IMF is considered to be basically what it does at its core is that it provides support to countries having issues with what we call the balance of payments. When a country, for example, is not able to have enough reserves, foreign currency reserves, because as you know, for a country to survive, it has to have foreign currency reserves because it does a lot of importation. It buys goods and services, and so it needs foreign reserves. And very often countries are not able to produce enough to export to get those reserves, and therefore they have to go to the IMF for support. And typically what happens when a country goes to the IMF for that kind of support, it comes with somewhat with what we call conditionalities, where the country has to go through certain measures, has to take on some policy, what we call policy prescriptions. It has to do certain things to ensure that it is able, one, to use whatever resources it borrows, but also it gets out of the situation that it is in and gets on its own feet. And to do that, we look at a series of different policies, both monetary policies that have to do with the currency, either weaken or strengthen the currency depending on the country, but also fiscal policy having to do with taxation, what kind of taxes you should impose, the levels at which those taxes should be imposed, and so on. So we use fiscal and monetary policies as what we call prescriptions to help the economy move out of this. So the IMF basically provides that policy advice to countries, not only in Africa, but across the world. There are close to 200 countries in the world. Every single country in the world right now is a member of the International Monetary Fund. And it basically helps in that way. So in a way, the IMF is there to look over the economies working together with the governments of those different countries.
Oh, okay. You said something about what kind of taxation you need to introduce. First thing, does it mean when IMF gives you loan or support, is it the one to dictate what kind of policies you need to put in place, you need to implement, or you need to follow, or you need to have as a country? Do they do that?
Yeah, well, it depends. So, for example, I found out that there is currently a program ongoing that Kenya has with the IMF. It's called an IMF program. And what it is an agreement that is reached between the country and the IMF that will agree for a certain amount of lending. So in the last program, for example, IMF lent to Kenya 437 million US dollars. Okay. Now, as part of that package or part of that lending to them, they will agree on certain policy measures. So, for example, the country was supposed to tighten or to increase its levels of revenue. That was one thing it was supposed to do. And at the same time, the government was asked to reduce its levels of expenditure. Okay, and the simple reason for that is because there was a huge, what we call a fiscal gap, where basically the country was not making as much as it was spending. And anytime you have that imbalance where you are basically, it's like an individual. If you're constantly spending more than you have, then after a while you're going to go broke and you're going to be in trouble. You might lose your home, you might lose your family, because you don't have enough money, right? It's the same thing for a country. If you keep spending what you do not have, then it means you have to do, one of the main things that you need to do is to keep borrowing. And you can keep borrowing to the point where it becomes a problem to repay those levels of debt. And we'll talk more about debt a little later on. But that program of the IMF, they agreed on certain measures, and also as a government to strengthen, to look, for example, at the weaknesses in state enterprises, because it was observed that the state enterprises in Kenya were basically soaking up a lot of those expenses. Right, basically resources were disappearing in those state enterprises, and as part of the agreement with the IMF, they were supposed to strengthen the weaknesses in the state enterprises, because that was one way of helping to reduce expenditure. Okay, so you can have those types of arrangements, those types of agreement, and that is what happened in this particular case.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Wow. I have another question before we proceed on. If the IMF decides it's like I borrowing you money, hey bro, can you help with 50 euros or something? Then you're like, okay, I'll give you 50 euro, but you dictate how I'm supposed to use it, or you dictate what I'm supposed to do with it, or you dictate how I'm supposed to pay you. Or, okay, pay you. You can dictate how you want me to pay you back, but you cannot dictate. I think you are not supposed to dictate to me what am I supposed to do so that I can be able to pay you back your money at a certain period of time. Do you think it's somehow sort of dictatorship, or it's like a lion with a toothless, or a toothless lion with the meat? Because
you see,
you have the meat,
yeah,
but you can't eat it. Or if you eat it, you are told how you need to eat it.
That's an excellent question. But you see, the problem is for the country is that by the time a country approaches the IMF for help, it is already in a bad condition. Okay, in the sense that things are already out of control. It's like a patient. When you feel that you're sick, you go to the doctor. So when you end up in the doctor's office, the doctor then helps you, gives you a prescription, prescribes medication, tells you should take some rest, you should do the other, and so on to get better. It's the same thing for a country. By the time a country goes to the IMF, it's because it probably have a huge debt problem. Its economy might be in problems, high unemployment rates, rising poverty, high debt levels, and so on. And so when you're in that condition, what you do is that you sit and you have a discussion with the economists from the IMF, and you agree together on some policy prescriptions. Okay, basically you prescribe something to help the economy recover, because at the end of the day, you want, as I said, you want the country to be able to repay its debt, but also you want the country to be strengthened and to move to a stronger footing. And so that's part of the discussion that goes on all the time.
Okay. I don't know. Ken, do you have a question?
Okay. Yeah, since we've started with the IMF, maybe I'll just get a question based on that concerns the IMF. Yeah, I know IMF looks at a number of qualifications before they lend to a country. And one of the important factors is about the governance of the countries. You realize that in Africa, like sometimes when I think a number of times there's a research that has been done by, is it Gallup, that ranks the countries in terms of their corruption indexes. Yeah, so, and then you realize that a country actually will be ranked like it's found to be so much corrupt. But then again, IMF will still actually continue lending the money. And with a lot of conditions, of course, these are loans, they're not actually grants. So what else can IMF do so that they can make sure that the governance first is put into some good kind of level? Because most of the African countries actually, we suffer from corruption, and corruption actually is coming up because of poor governance. most of these African countries, you realize that there's a lot of nepotism taking place. There's a lot of corruption taking place. So, what are some of the factors that IMF can put in place so that before even lending these monies to the countries, they ensure that governance actually is at some level, so that all these monies, when they are brought, they can be used specifically for the development factors that have been taken for. What are some of the indicators or some of the things that IMF can do to just like make sure that the level of corruption or governance is actually put to some kind of level?
Yeah, no, that is a real dilemma. For example, I'm in a country, South Sudan, where it is ranked by Transparency International as the second most corrupt country in the world. All right. So, and they just signed an agreement with the IMF about 2 weeks ago for about $117 million. All right. Now, the fact of the matter is that these countries are members of the IMF and they contribute. There's a kind of what we call a quota system where, depending on the size of the economy, you have access to a certain level of resources. So it's almost automatic, so to speak, that as a member, that part of the membership privileges that you have being part of the IMF is that you have access to some level of resources based on that quota that you allotted. All right, so you pay a subscription fee every year, and then you basically have access to those resources. So, in that sense, the IMF does not necessarily look at the level of corruption per se. What they will try to do, though, is that with the monies that they give to those particular countries. For example, I talked about the $447 million that they give in the last program. They will have a certain set of conditions around that particular loan. And that's why they will specify, for example, where these monies could be spent. And they try as much as possible to not allow it to go the way of corruption. But that is something that is very difficult to control. As you said, it's a major problem in all of Africa. It's not just in Africa, it's all over the world, but it seems to be a lot more pronounced on the continent. And that is the reason why, for example, we get into problems in the first place. Because a number of African countries, I'm not speaking just in terms of Kenya, but a number of African countries have enough resources that if those resources were properly managed, if there was little or no corruption, those countries would be doing extremely well. They would be able to take care of their population. There would be very little poverty because they have sufficient, they have over and above them other resources that is required. But as you rightly pointed out, because of the level of corruption, these resources are misspent. These resources ends up in the hands of individuals, sometimes government officials, sometimes the friends or families of government officials. And there is simply not enough money to go around to the country. And so that is sometimes a void that the IMF tries to fill, because monies that would otherwise should be coming to the government, probably through taxes, but because there are so many loopholes in the tax system, you have people evading taxes, you have the taxes not being collected, or if they're collected, they are stolen and so on. Then the government has to find a way, the IMF has to find a way to help the people of the country. And they come in, they make those loans available to the country, but with conditions. So it's really a response to that level of corruption. But that is something, obviously, the IMF does not have the resources or the ability to police any particular state. All right. For example, you could not tell. I mean, in all my travels throughout Africa and discussions with the Ministry of Finance, the Minister of Finance, the central bank, the governors, and so on of the central banks, it is very difficult when you go in for 2-3 weeks to look at the books and to discuss. It's very difficult to know, to get a firm sense as to who is doing what, where the monies are going. That particular aspect should be left to civic groups within the country, either an anti-corruption commission or the civil society groups. They're the ones that should be kind of policing the government as far as corruption is concerned. But it's very difficult for the IMF to do.
Thank you.
Okay. I think I've got you. We've got you. Okay, you have another question?
Just a brief clarification. We have World Bank and IMF. Yes. These bodies are more or less like the same. So what are like the roles of IMF as opposed to the roles of the World Bank?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and people confuse those two all the time. Yeah, and they think it's one and the same institutions. These are two very different institutions, although we call them sister organizations, because, as I said, they both came out around the same time. They are both Bretton Woods institutions, but the World Bank was set up primarily as a bank that would lend to countries. Okay, so the World Bank is more like a traditional bank would, in the role of a traditional bank, but except that they lend to countries, either to governments or to even the private sector within those countries, and they give loans, the project loans really. So they give loans, for example, for the building of dams, roads, bridges, airports, and so on. That's the task of the World Bank. The IMF, on the other hand, is a monetary institution. It's more concerned about monetary policies, more concerned about stabilization of the currencies around the world. Okay, so it looks into areas of monetary policy, and in that sense, it is not a strict lender. And even when it lends, most times its lending is in support of a country's currency. Its lending is in support of strengthening the country's currency so that the country can get on its feet and operate. So it lends directly to the government and only to the government, whereas the banks, the World Bank would lend to the private sector within the country. So it's a very distinct type of function for both, although we are confused very often. So the IMF, again, is more policy oriented, more towards monetary policy, more towards stabilizing of the exchange rate system. And the World Bank is more concerned about giving loans in support, project loans to the countries.
Okay. So basically, it means when a country's economy is on its knees, that's when IMF can come in deeply. Yeah. So
absolutely. Okay. So you hear, for example, about an IMF bailout. It's usually where a country is in trouble, probably its banking system has collapsed, it has run out of reserves, of foreign exchange reserves, the economy is collapsing. That is when the IMF steps in. Yeah.
Okay. So now, currently, we've seen there's been a global economical challenge. So each and every single country is facing some economical challenge. They can't afford this. The living standards have gone high. Prices are being increased. Basically, you being part of the economy advisory for Kenya, I know you've been there and you know how much they've lended. And now if you look at the status of Kenya right now, back there, how it's going, how people are crying, people are complaining, and now you're already in South Sudan, you're in Sudan itself, knowing the history of Kenya, as you say. So maybe you can give us an easy an eye for that, because we see like the economy has collapsed, but you see we've had a lot of debts. How can we come out of these debts, or how can we do something different to make us face a different economical challenge?
Kenya is in a lot of economic trouble, as you rightly pointed out. And like any African country, it is struggling to provide employment for the young people in particular. So you have a high rate of youth unemployment. You have high debt levels. What we use is a measure called the debt to GDP ratio. The GDP, or the gross domestic product, is the total output of a country. For Kenya, it's about $110.3 billion right now, about $110.3 billion US dollars.
Wow.
That is considered to be what we call the size of the economy. That's how you kind of measure. It is really the total production of goods and services within the country for a given year. Okay, so in that case, in the case of Kenya, it's about 110.3 billion. But the debt levels, your debt is about 67% of that. Okay, so you're talking about debt levels of 110 million, almost 70 billion dollars in debt. Okay, or if you like a stock, what we call a stock of debt, $70 billion in debt has a lot of repercussions. To begin with, you have to service those debts. Okay, you have to service this debt, and I'm looking at the breakdown between the external debt, which is 35.2% of that. So let's say roughly 47 or so billion dollars is owed to either banks or governments or the multilateral institutions, World Bank, IMF, the Paris Club, which is the developed countries and so on. You're owing that debt to those countries. Now, why is that significant? With that high level of debt, it means that you have to be servicing those debts. Okay, so it means that all your revenues that you're earning and also your hard-earned foreign exchange goes back towards paying this debt, towards servicing this debt. Right? Because the last thing a country wants is to default on its debt. When a country defaults on its debt, it suddenly is shut out from being able to borrow. And very few countries can survive without the ability to borrow. It's like an individual, if you really want to live for the average person to live a decent life, they have to have some level of borrowing. They borrow for a mortgage because they can't afford to have all the money one time to build a house. So they'll borrow for a mortgage. They will borrow for a car. They might borrow to furnish their house and so on. It's the same thing for a country. A country, it does not have all of the resources at any given time, so it borrows. The problem with the borrowing for a lot of countries is that they borrow and then the money is wasted. It goes into consumption, it goes into corruption, it disappears into private bank accounts and so on. At the end of the day, there's nothing to show for it. There is no investment, there is no production, and you're stuck with a bill. So think of an individual, right? You go to a bank, you say you want a loan to build a house. But instead of taking the money to build a house, you spend it on partying and travel and so on. At the end of the day, you have nothing to show. You don't have the house. What you have is the debt. You're holding debt. You still have to pay that debt, but you have nothing to show for it. All right, and you have to pay for it. So it's the same thing for the countries. You find that these countries have those huge levels of debt that they now have to pay for. But there are some very important implications. The number one is that it poses a strain on your foreign currency. Okay, and the way countries earn foreign currency is through exports. Either they export in goods or they export in services. In the case of Kenya, you export manufactured goods to neighboring African countries. You export fresh produce and so on here to South Sudan, for example. I buy vegetables and so on that come from Kenya. So you export agricultural produce. You also have tourists coming in to your national parks and so on. So you get, that's different ways in which you gain foreign currency. By the end of the day, you have to turn around and use that foreign currency to service that debt. And that creates a big problem. So the number one issue, I think, is a high level of debt. And let me just give you a comparison. So in the case of South Sudan, Kenya, when you take the level of debt, we said it's 67% of GDP. If you compare a country like the United States, for example, it's around 23%, right? Countries that are doing really well, their debt levels is around 23, between 15 and say 30% of GDP. In the case of Kenya, it is 67%.
Wow.
So it shows you the big disparity. So you're really in a state of what we call debt distress, where the debt becomes a real burden, a burden to repay. And the other important thing about repaying this debt is that it takes away the ability to put money into other areas. So the government, for example, is now restricted in probably building hospitals or building schools or the public facilities, because now it has to use a lot of that money to repay those debts. So that's a very serious problem. The other important economic indicator that I looked at is the difference between what the government is receiving in terms of tax revenues, either through taxes or non-tax revenue, what they're receiving and what they're paying. So it is, you're spending, for example, 24.2% of your GDP. So 24.2% of this $110 billion goes into spending by the government, but only 16% is received in revenue. So you have a gap of 8% effectively, an 8% gap of GDP. That works out to roughly 8%. That's about $8 billion gap. Now, if you have that gap every year on your current spending, it means you have to keep borrowing. That's the only way, because you have to maintain your wage bill, your public services wage bill. You have to maintain your support for public enterprises. You have to maintain your support for infrastructure, whether it is, for example, if the government is giving subventions to Kenya Airways, for example, those have to be maintained. So already the government has spending, it means effectively that they have to keep borrowing to maintain that level of spending. So an 8% gap is huge. Countries generally try to get it down to about 2%, 2 to 3%. When you're at 8%, you are really in a very difficult place. And so when you have that, it is up to the government now to try to do two things. If you have high expenditure, you can try to reduce those expenditures. Or if you're not able to reduce those expenditures, you have to try to increase your revenues. And typically, to increase your revenues, it means an increased tax burden, all right? Because the government's major source of revenue is through taxes. So typically, if you're trying to increase your revenues, it is either you increase your taxes or you increase the productive base of the economy. You're able to create additional employment opportunities. You're able to grow the private sector. You're able to attract foreign direct investment that may invest in hotels, in other types of businesses, and so on. You grow your revenue pool, and then you can increase your revenues. So it's a challenge for the government to actually keep doing that, and at the same time to really stay afloat. It's a very tough challenge.
Oh wow! Okay. You know how you've explained it. Now I'm having some butterflies there on my stomach, thinking and trying to imagine the kind of situation that the country is now going through as Kenya right now. Because you see, the government is also trying to introduce some forceful levies, like you have to build a house, and we need to get some tax from your 3% from your salary.
Absolutely.
So
That's exactly what it is. Yeah, that's how they raise the revenues. Yeah.
Okay. So what's the worst that can happen if the citizens decide to rebel from this, demonstrate on this? What's the worst situation? What's the worst situation that can happen that IMF can decide and take as a point of action?
Well, the worst situation is that the citizenry might feel, for example, that it is unfair. They might feel that some of those taxes are unfair, and they might take to the streets. And when they take to the streets, that could descend into violence. You could have violent protests and so on. And no country really wants that. You want the country to be stable, because if, for example, a major source of revenue for Kenya is through tourism. So if tomorrow people are taken to the streets and the whole country is disrupted through violent protest action, the first thing that's going to take a hit is the tourist arrivals, right? So already right there, you're going to be losing resources. So, that is the worst case scenario, where people take a hit or people can decide, well, it's our country. That's the kind of sacrifice that we have to make. But also it's very important as well. I think that what the citizens can do in these countries is to probably speak out more loudly against corruption, probably speak out more loudly against lax government rules and regulations and so on, because that is very important. Because what you really want in your country is not to overburden your citizens, but that happens often, where you have, as I said, large-scale corruption and so on, and that has this negative impact. But yeah, you talked about this levy, and it is possible that at some point taxes could be raised. For example, you go to the airport, all of a sudden you're charged an extra $100 for a travel fee or something. The fees begin to appear from everywhere, and the citizens might get tired. But it's just the government trying to increase its levels of revenue, because if it does not get that revenue from the citizens, it has to go and lend. Either it borrows from the domestic banking sector, or it borrows from outside.
Okay. So can this lead to a downfall of a regime?
Well, it depends. I mean, we have seen certain countries where violent protests have led to regime change, right? So it is quite possible. It has happened in some Central American countries where persons have been, they go against the government that impose austerity measures. That happened in Colombia in the 80s and so on. Where you will find that the people, they rise up to such an extent that at the end of the day the government folds, but it's not something obviously I would advocate. I think it's something where you can always dialogue, and that's why I think for a number of countries it's very important to have very strong civic groups, groups that can dialogue with the government, groups that can keep a close watch on the actions of that government to ensure that the resources of the state are not wasted, or it does not disappear through corruption, but instead it is used to deliver services to the people and also used to create jobs and employment opportunities.
Oh, wow! I think I'm getting what I'm getting. So in a few minutes, I'll be reading some comments from people here. I see Bob Sepe is tuned in. Kelly Ken Rogers Odinga is tuned in. Thank you so much. Nyamumbo Nyakwarmori. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Kennedy Obuya. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Apoyo Bigi. Thank you so much. Dorino Witty. Thank you so much. Wow, thank you. The comments are coming thick and fast, thick and fast. Thank you so much, Rita. Thank you so much, Cyril Brenda. Thank you so much, Freda Bob. Thank you so much, Achieng Makonya. Sorry, I'm not able to join today. She really wanted to join, but I think due to unavoidable circumstances, she could not. Yeah, Deja, thank you so much. Yeah, Ken, do you have a question?
Yeah, this is more of just my observation. I look at the growth, the economic growth of our African countries, and actually we are doing very poorly. IMF gives loans to our African countries, including Kenya. Then you realize that before they even finish the previous loan, then they get another loan. And the country is actually like overburdened, even in terms of making this repayment. Of course, IMF cannot even give them some kind of debt forgiveness, because I'm sure IMF is in the business of making money when they lend to these countries. So what do you think? Does IMF, maybe the department that approves and validates all the loans, do they do like the monitoring and evaluation to find out that the loans that were given to the countries have actually been put into the use in which it was requested for? Because I think that instead of the loans becoming so expensive for a country, maybe a country could even go and get some private loans from, say, a country like China, because of course at the moment China is really developing and is been giving a lot of loans to the African countries. So do you think the country could have some kind of opportunity or some leeway to maybe compare what China could give and what IMF can give, so that you do the cost benefit analysis and then go for a cheaper loan?
But interestingly enough, the rate at which the IMF lends to countries is actually quite small in comparison to the rates at which they would borrow from bilaterally from countries or from the private banking system. And it's also a very small portion of that, and it's a very simple, and there's a reason for that, in that what the IMF gives to the country is usually tied to its quota, to its size. So most of the loans, so for example, I talked about a 70 billion debt level for Kenya. I have not looked at the figures, but I can guarantee you that the percent of the loans to the IMF of that amount is very small. Most of that is loans to China, is loans to other developed countries. It's not necessarily to the IMF. Okay, so importantly as well, if you like, the external portion of the debt for Kenya is 35.2%. So that means another 32% is domestic, that is borrowing from the banking system in the country. And when the government borrows from the banking system, it borrows at the commercial rate. And I'm sure your commercial rate is anywhere from 10 to 15% in Kenya. Probably 7. It may get some concessions at 7%, 10%. So whereas you may be borrowing locally at probably 8, 10%, from the IMF, you would probably be borrowing at 3, 4%. So the rate is not where the problem is with the IMF. It is really with the other countries, with the other creditors, and with the domestic system that the government is borrowing from. And the other thing I should add is in terms of the debt forgiveness. We were involved in a very important program started in 2000 in the IMF, and probably went on for like 6-7 years. And that was called the Heavily Indebted Poor Country Initiative, or the HIPIC initiative, where debt forgiveness was negotiated for several African countries. And in exchange for those negotiations, the debt owed to the multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the International Finance Corporation, and so on, and as well as to the Paris Club countries, that's the more developed countries, whether it's the US, France, Italy, and so on. What happened in this case was that the countries were supposed to use those monies that they would receive in debt forgiveness. What they would not pay, they were supposed to spend that on health and education. And we had a situation where that worked very well in a number of African countries. But the fact is, 14, 15 years later, the country's debt levels are back up, because no sooner did their debt levels drop through that initiative, they were once again borrowing and borrowing heavily. And so debt levels began to rise. And I just give you a very good example of how that can happen. If you have a fiscal balance every year of 8%, it means that you have to be borrowing 8%. You're borrowing $8 billion a year, really. If you're borrowing that amount in a year, it does not take long for you to be at $100 billion. It only takes like 10 years and you're at $100 billion, right? So it happens very quickly. And that's why you find countries pile on that debt very, 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 very quickly.
And what are some of the repercussions for a country that takes a lot of time before doing the repayments, or that a country that does not honor the payment obligations the way it was agreed in the contract?
You see, a country operates very much like an individual. And you live in the US and you may understand that better than say probably, because it's probably not as much in Africa. But in the US, for example, you have a process of what they call a credit score. For countries, it's called a credit rating. And the higher your score, if you are paying on time, if you could have debts, but if you're paying those debts on time, you get a good credit score. And that allows you to get loans at a cheaper rate. You can go to a bank and you can negotiate a cheaper rate. The same thing for a country. If, however, you as an individual, if you're constantly paying late, if you're constantly missing payments and so on, you get a very poor credit score. And when you have to borrow, they charge you a higher interest rate. The same thing for a country. If your credit rating is not good, when you go to the banks, a country with a good credit rating could be borrowing from the same bank at 5%, and you with a poor credit rating could be borrowing at 15%. Okay, and that is where a lot of countries get into trouble, because if you begin to miss your payment, if you begin to skip a payment, you have a problem. And that is why as well countries try, even before they take care of their health services or their education services, they try to pay their debt, because they understand that if they don't repay that debt, they will have trouble later on borrowing more. And there's always that constant need to borrow, as I explained earlier.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. I see Asembo is here. He's been late. He's the late comer. But yeah, he found us already eating. So let him not complain that the food is not enough for him.
I'll share what's available. Thank you, Mr. Thomas, for coming through to discuss the matter of money and how best Kenyans can understand what happens with IMF. And I have a question that really I wanted you to get a clarification on that. If a country goes under coup, where military takes over country, And most of African countries have gone under coup. What happens to the money that they've borrowed from IMF? Do they restart again? Do they continue whatever is there? Because this is a coup. The country has gone haywire. There's nothing going to happen. There's no system now happening. They're starting afresh. Let's say Kenya goes to that situation whereby there's military taking over and they're cleaning up the system. What happens in that situation?
The debt remains. The debt is owed by the country. The country remains. The government may change, and the government may change through coup or through a democratic process. The country remains, and the debt belongs to the country. So that remains. Nothing changes there as far as the debt is concerned.
Yeah.
Boxer, you've been eating. Let me now eat.
Actually, I go. Sorry to interject. On that matter of country goes into coup. Okay, you say like country acts like a person, like an individual. For instance, the country dies. What if, as an individual, if I die, I can't pay the loan? I've gone with the loan.
Yes, well, there are some loans that even if you die, it continues, right, with your family. For example, mortgage. Unless you have a mortgage policy, a mortgage insurance, even if you die, that continues. So if your house is willed to your children, they will inherit that debt. The debt doesn't just disappear with you. You see, and the very same thing for a country. It's probably easier for an individual because in some cases the debt does in fact die with you. But in the case of a country, the debt lives on. It continues into perpetuity because it belongs to the country. And that is why, when we choose our governments, we have to be careful because if we choose the wrong government, they could plunge the country to that debt burden. And of course, if there is a coup, well, there is no control. But in terms of choosing an elected government, that's why people have to be so careful as to who they select as the leaders.
Okay. Assemble.
So if the military takes over government, they have to carry on with the bandage that has been put on the regime, or they have to
Absolutely.
continue paying what
They have to continue. Yes. And if they default, what happens is that as soon as you default, you close the window for further borrowing. And bear in mind, the debt that they inherit is already gone. Most likely, it's already spent. It's not money borrowed and it's sitting there. It's money that has been borrowed that has been spent, right? So it is no longer there. What remains is the repayment. So if you default on that repayment, all of a sudden you no longer have access. All right, and very often is the same country you inherited. You still have this imbalance in your spending and your revenues, and you have to borrow. So if you default, that's the biggest mistake you could ever make because right away you either close yourself up completely from being able to borrow, or if you do borrow, it's at very punitive rates, very, very high interest rates, which makes it even worse for you as a country.
And Mr. Thomas, what's the thin line that differentiates between IMF and the World Bank? Because most of the time people really mix this together. If you can elaborate and make us understand what IMF is that is not World Bank, because these will normally come together. People can normally bring them together.
Yes,
you actually answered that.
Oh, really? Okay.
Should I say it again or should what should we?
For those who came late like me.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically, as I explained earlier, the World Bank focuses on basically borrowing or giving loans for development purposes. But those loans could go either to the government or to private sector. And it's really project loans. So the World Bank will finance a dam and they will finance an electric facility, for example, roads, bridges, and those kind of things, right? That is where it's like a regular loan you'd get from a bank, except that it comes from the World Bank, and the rates are usually lower. It's not as high as the commercial bank rates, but that is really for project lending. The IMF gives in support of a country's currency. So if the monetary system is under stress, then that's where the IMF comes in. It really comes in support of a country's currency. So it's a very different type of lending in that sense. And typically when the country gets resources is to help support their exchange rate or help support their level of reserves, of foreign reserves.
Okay.
And the IMF only lends to countries. It does not lend to the private sector. It only lends to countries in support of their exchange rate or in support of their reserves.
Okay, something else concerning the exchange rates. What role does IMF play in just ensuring that there's some stability in the exchange rate in the countries they're lending to? Because right now I look at like the exchange rate between the dollar and Kenya shillings is too big, and it means that the currency is getting weaker and weaker, such that if nothing actually is if no intervention is actually brought into place, then I'm sure by the end of the year we could be buying $1 at like 150, something like that. So what role that the IMF play so that at least we try to like strengthen our economies, our currencies?
Yeah, now the whole question of exchange rate policy is one that the country has to think through very carefully, because a weakening exchange rate where your currency is getting weaker against the US dollar, it is shown by you having to give up a lot more. So for example, let's assume now the exchange rate is 50 Kenyan shillings to the dollar, and all of a sudden it moves from 50 to 60. It means that your currency is weakening against the US dollar because you have to give up more Kenyan shillings for the US dollar. Now, when that is happening, that could be good if you're a net exporter. If you're exporting a lot of goods, for example, then your goods suddenly become cheaper. Because if I have US dollars in a foreign country and I want to buy a Kenyan good, if before I was offering you $10 at 50, at the exchange rate of 50 to the dollar, all of a sudden it goes up to 60. Instead of giving you $10 for that good, I'll probably now be giving you $8. So it's to my benefit. It's cheaper for me. If it's cheaper for me, I will tend to buy more. So sometimes countries deliberately weaken the exchange rate so that they can increase the level of exports. But then there is a flip side to it. If you're a net importer and your exchange rate is weakening, it is not necessarily a good thing, because it means that you have to be constantly be giving up more of your currency for the foreign currency. And what could happen is that over time, you could find that you have a shortage of foreign currency in the country. And that may not necessarily be a good thing, because all of a sudden, individuals want to travel, they find that they cannot go to the bank and get currency because there are restrictions on how much they can take out, and you have all sorts of problems. So it's usually deliberate exchange rate policy, and a weakening currency as well could be inflationary in the sense that it could lead to higher prices, especially if you're a net importer. If you're importing practically everything that you want to use, you're consuming clothes, shoes, your services, insurance, everything that you are importing, it is quite possible that you're going to find that weakening of your currency can also be inflationary, and because you have to be constantly demanding more and more US currency or foreign currency, that leads to inflation, higher prices, and that's not a good thing most times, because higher prices will have a very big impact on the poor people in particular within the country.
Okay, and there's one thing right now, Mr. Thomas, and this is something many people don't agree with, but it's happening. There's new colonization whereby Europe and the other countries are still coming back to struggle for pieces of Africa. They're trying to colonize Africa in a modern way. So, for example, let me say, can China clear Kenyan debt, and now China clears, let me say, China clears Kenya's debt, and now Kenya becomes free? And what happens in that situation? Is that possible?
I think Kenyans would do well to look at what happened with Zambia. I don't know if you're familiar with the case of Zambia, where Zambia thought that they were getting a good deal from the Chinese because they were borrowing from the Chinese to build their infrastructure, build ports and bridges and roads and so on. And they thought they were doing a good thing, only to find out that when they began to default, then their ports were no longer theirs, right? And that's a very serious concern. And it's the same thing. There is nothing like a free lunch. If the Chinese come in today and tell you, okay, I'm going to clear your debt, I'm going to pay your debt to the multilateral institutions, I'm going to pay your debt to the different countries from which you're borrowing, I'm going to pay your debt to the commercial banking system, then you have to ask, why? What is it? Because it cannot be free. There must be something behind it. And even where we see China has stepped in to help those countries, they're not doing it for free. They themselves are actually borrowing. So they might be lending to you at a lower exchange rate or at a lower interest rate, but there is still a rate attached to it. And the conditions may appear to be easier, but at the end of the day, if you're not able to pay, then there may be something within that contract that would allow them to probably seize your infrastructure. And that has happened in Africa, and that is something that countries have to be aware of.
Okay, but you've really explained things very clear. So I don't know. Maybe Asembo, you come in again.
I think he's muted.
Oh yeah,
You're muted.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
The way Thomas makes it simple and very clear that if China pay for Kenya, then Kenya belongs to China. No,
Absolutely, no doubt about it.
They start bringing their policemen, they start taxing everything.
Yeah. So we have to be careful. We have to be very careful about that, and I think the best policy that the countries can adopt is to really try to grow the economy. Because if you grow the economy, if you try to reduce the level of corruption, on the level of waste, if you strengthen your public institutions, if you strengthen your enterprises that you're associated with, that's the best way to go. Grow the economy, create employment opportunities. Kenya has a very large diaspora population, I'm sure, in the UK, in the US, and so on. You can call upon the diaspora population to invest in the country, to do business. In fact, Ghana is a very good example of that. Ghana is doing very, very well these days, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that the Ghanaian diaspora, they're coming back into the country. They're setting up businesses. They're opening up boutiques. They're opening up restaurants and hotels and so on, and they're investing back into the country. And as a result, the economy is growing. That is something that Kenya can do and appeal to its diaspora to invest in the country. Instead of putting all the money overseas, come back, do something, start a small cottage industry, employ 2-3 people, and before you know it, the country can grow by leaps and bounds. And that is where I think that the countries need to be looking. The idea that we should, as African countries, be constantly be looking to another country to help us, I think is a thing of the past. And in a way, we can resist this new colonization. And the way we do it is by probably allowing our people to be more invested in our countries, and especially our people who have gone overseas and done well for themselves. They can now come back and invest in the country.
Oh yeah, and we've seen the BRIC has been there from all the way back from 2001, but they were not all that active, I may say. But right now we've seen them coming out strong and coming up with a different mind of having a different currency. What's your take on this? Is this a good thing for Africa to join in? Because already we've seen South Africa in it, and we are seeing America struggling so hard to maintain its top dollar. What's your take on this?
Okay, for those who don't know what the BRIC is, this is the grouping of what we call the BRIC countries. That is Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and what's the other one? And China. Yeah, and these countries are talking, and a lot of that has to do with providing an alternative to the Bretton Woods institution, an alternative to the World Bank and to the IMF. And the question is whether or not that can actually, catch on. Now, one of the things I will mention now is that the US dollar the US dollar acts as a reserve currency for the world, okay? In the sense that if you're traveling, particularly in any country in the world, if you have US currency, you can be sure to get a meal because practically every country will accept US currency. And that's probably the only currency that has that kind of cachet. It's used in practically every single country. Now, if you're talking about moving away from this wide acceptability of the US currency to a currency that is offered by the BRIC countries, then that is something else. The question is whether or not it will be as widely accepted, whether or not countries will accept it. And part of the reason why the US dollar is so powerful is because it is backed up by a very strong economy. One of the strongest, the US economy is probably the strong and has been for many, many years. The question is whether the BRIC countries can really serve as a good substitute for America and for the currency. And that is, I think, that's the kind of discussion that a lot of people are having. Now, China, for example, a lot of China's thrust into Africa has been for its own benefit. Okay, China is invested in Africa, so they build, for example, they build you roads, right? But they build you roads from the mines to the port, right? So they extract, the gold and the other metal is extracted, and it is either sent by train to the port, tracks that they've built, or roads that they've built directly to a port that they've built, and then it's exported. So it is really in their best. It's really in their best interest, right? Now, is that a model that African countries can really truly benefit from? All right. So that is the kind of questions I think Africa has to ask itself, and also it is driven by ideology, right? How do we compete against the West? How do we compete against what has been a very successful system over all of those years? And the question then becomes, will the US dollar lose its place?
Oh, sorry, guys. Our guest seems something has happened to the internet, and stay tuned for like a few minutes before we close the show. Ken, Twak iye pek ka gi jo kisungu, jo IMF, jo mamiyo ji otas. Koro wan joluo gini nyaka wan ng'e maber, kendo gini onego wamak malong'o. Governors magwa wan gi jogo manyamiyo rieko mag ohala, mag yudo pesa. Koro gini nyaka wamany motegno kaka wadonjo gini madonjo Luo Nyanza ka. Jo Siaya, Homa Bay, Migori. Oh, welcome back, our guest. Sorry, nothing happened to you.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened. I may have just touched there. Yeah, it's possible. Yeah.
So for you right now, you don't think it's the right move for Africa to jump into it because we're not yet accepted worldwide?
Yeah. I would wait and see. It's never good to be the guinea pigs. Let us see let it establish itself first. Let us see what they have to offer. So, for example, if they're offering Africa increased trade, for example, increased markets for the goods and the services, a fairer price for their metals and their minerals and so on, yes. But if it's more of the same type where China is just looking to dump its cheap goods on the countries, then you have to be careful about that.
I have a question. This is, I think it's politically based through the ideologies of IMF. Is it true when a country develops without taking the loan from IMF or the World Bank, it becomes a threat to this money supporting organization through the world? Like you see some other country, I don't want to mention the names because I don't have the rights to do so, or it has not been proven yet. It might put me to trouble. But you find a country was going well, it had a good president, but after seeing that is not borrowing money from these organizations like IMF and the World Bank or even the China, it is alleged that he was killed because he had development mindset and he actually was able to stop corruption in the country. And after these people seeing this, they arranged for his assassination, and now he was poisoned to death. Is it that IMF is forcing, or these money foundations are forcing themselves into Africa so that they make the Africa and the African people dependent to them instead of making Africa independent to them by themselves?
Yeah, the fact of the matter is countries come to the IMF when they're already, as we said earlier, when they're already in some problems, right? Where they're having difficulties in their economies. And that is at that point they request assistance from the IMF. Now, if countries are able to develop independent of that, but I'll tell you, to me, the main problem with Africa really has been corruption and the inability of our leaders to safeguard the resources of Africa for Africans. Okay, so for example, we don't produce cell phones in Africa, but we produce every critical element of the cell phone in Africa. Okay, we don't produce chocolate in Africa, but we produce the cocoa in Africa, right? So a lot of what we've done, I think a lot of the problems in Africa is self-inflicted. Why is there not a thriving chocolate industry in Africa? I have not seen one cocoa tree in Switzerland, yet it's a multi-billion-dollar industry for Switzerland, the chocolate industry.
Yeah.
The countries that produce the cocoa are struggling. Why can't we build, all you need is water and milk, I think, for chocolate, and you have the major ingredient. But we have not exploited that. So I think a lot of it has to do with the policy that the countries have adopted. And I will not put the blame on other countries, because I don't think that there are countries sitting and saying, well, let us keep this country down. Let us not let this country move. I don't think it's as simple as that. I think it's something where in a lot of instances, leaders lose their way, they become corrupt, they begin to feather their own nest, they begin to put monies away and so on for the family. You have the nepotism, you have, family involvement, all the rest of it. You have those problems that we create ourselves. And I don't believe that there is any sinister, nothing in my 14 years at the IMF led me to believe that there was any sinister plan within the IMF to somehow disempower or reduce on the development of any country. To the contrary, we were constantly seeking ways to help those countries develop, help those countries put forward policies that can create jobs, that can help reduce the levels of poverty, and so on. But you have those issues, though. You have those issues where colonialism is real, and it has been, especially in the Francophone countries. I worked on some Francophone countries. And for example, I'll give you an example. When I worked on Niger had an arrangement with the French government where they were selling uranium, which is their major export. They could not sell uranium on the open market. They were forced to sell at a certain price to France. So let's assume the price of uranium was, say, $1,000 an ounce. They would probably be, that's on the world market, they would probably have to sell to France at $500 an ounce, right? and that was a purely colonialist type of policy. But again, I still blame the government, right? Because I still felt that the government could be more assertive. I still felt that government could be looking at more in their interests and say, well, okay, well, all right, if we can't get the price we want, the uranium stays in the ground rather than sell it. But again, it depends on how the governments choose to do and what they choose to do by the people. Yeah, but I certainly would not blame necessarily any invisible hand that is trying to somehow subvert the governments of Africa and so on. I would put the blame first and foremost on our leaders. Let's put it that way.
Okay, in that issue of okay, I can justify it. Okay, like this, you find a leader it came very straightforward with the same ideas that you have. Like, we are not going to export ore anymore. We are going to export copper. We are not going to export sugarcane. We are going to export sugar. Yeah. Then you find this person here has these ideologies of making a country a better place and saying you're going to have all these industries in our own ability and capability, whereby those people will have to look for jobs in our country, not us going out to look for jobs in their country. But then you find there's this magic they play on the air during the election. You find this guy won, but they fix someone else in the help of the international communities because they have an interest in that country. Because they know if a boxer becomes the president, you won't allow them to take these things anymore. Look at the scenario that happened in Tanzania. Because Tanzania has they had the Tanzanite and they're actually rich in mineral salts like the gold, diamond, and the stones. So the president came in and said, all these people who are alleged and who they had hand in taking our mineral salts for their own benefit, we are taking them to the High Court, criminal court, where they were brought in The Hague, and they were told to pay them 100 billion back to the Tanzanian. But before they finished that, the president died because he was focused in economics and he was focused in bringing the country to his foot, which was in 50% completion. But it was done with. Same to other neighboring countries. The president, the person who's supposed to win, is not winning. Yes, he's won, but somebody else is being announced by the help of the foreigners.
Yeah, but that brings me to the same question. Why is it that this somebody else, why is that somebody else not have the same mindset as this other person? Okay, we should not be able to play off one against each other that way. Everybody, all the African leaders who are aspiring for leadership in Africa should be of the same mindset. And if that's the case, you can't kill all the leaders. You know, so that's the point I was making. I still blame the leaders. Because let's assume that what you're saying is correct, that this country can in fact impose a leader, but that's a leader from within the country. Why is it that this leader that is imposed does not have the same mindset as that leader who is probably not wanted? Okay, so I think ultimately it boils down to the leadership of those countries.
Perfectly. Boxer, my last question from Sir Thomas is, in the same situation where Boxer is talking about people being imposed the wrong leadership, and they're told they're no longer a country, there is a company with the shareholders. Can IMF or World Bank finance or support a country that's going under self-determination? For if now let's say Kenya is going under self-determination, a section of Kenya is moving out from that company because they call it company, and they want to start up afresh. Do IMF continue the same debt, or they can fund a new self-determination country that is formed within Kenya?
You see, the IMF is made up of sovereign countries. So in that case, the sovereign country there is Kenya. Kenya is the one that is a member of the IMF. And I'll give an example again in South Sudan, where I am. South Sudan used to be part of Sudan. It used to be one country. Sudan was the sovereign in the IMF, right? When South Sudan got its independence from Sudan, as an independent country, it then became a sovereign and could join the IMF, all right? But now it is now a sovereign. So you now have both Sudan and South Sudan, two different sovereign countries within the IMF. So that is how it's done. It has to be a sovereign country that has been supported or that has been funded. But again, as I said, the IMF support is very restricted, and it's really a small fraction of the debt of any country, because it is so directed towards those particular areas, as I said, of the monetary support and shoring up because after all, the major function of the IMF is for exchange rate stability. All right. And that is what they focus on. So, I don't know that there are any sinister motives in terms of the lending and in terms of trying to.
There was a leader who said if the government of the day doesn't come to terms or respect the bipartisan tone that's ongoing, they may go for self-determination. That's why I'm asking if they go for self-determination and become a sovereign. So they start a fresh loans. They start a fresh.
They will start afresh. Yeah, if you have a new country coming out of then that's a different country. It's a new independent sovereign. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Aboxan, back to you.
Wow, I don't know because we still have a lot to talk about, but we see the time on our side. Time is not on our side. Yeah, because I see other people want to go to work, other ones to start working. So I don't know. Maybe we can. I don't know. What do you think, Assemble? We can proceed, or
we'll get time again and invite Mr. Thomas back again to clarify for us as time goes by, because maybe by then Kenya may have gone under self-determination and maybe another government place, and the company will have remained with other people, their shareholders. So when time comes up again, we'll invite him back to share with us and give us more highlights on World Bank and MIF, how they do their monetary things and all how they take their responsibilities. We really appreciate you, Mr. Thomas, for coming through, and we'll always come to you to give us some guidance and highlights on what to go about it. Thank you.
Yes, it has certainly been my pleasure being with you. I certainly enjoyed the discussion, and I hope that the audience were able to understand and get something out from what we were discussing tonight.
Oh, yeah.
It's been a pleasure.
Of course they did. Kenneth, maybe you say something, Ken?
Yeah, it was nice. It was a very nice discussion. And I think this kind of topic cannot be handled within 1 hour. So I think we just have to prioritize and then request the doctor to just give us another time. I think what we've discussed is very paramount even to the understanding of what we can do as the citizens of our country, so that we can be able to make sure that we do the much we can to develop our countries. Yeah, so I think we have to prioritize and then have another discussion to just actually continue with this one wherever we have reached.
Oh yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, but before we close it, maybe I want to give some shout outs to the listeners and the viewers who have been following us. Onyango Midigo, thank you so much. I'm trying to mix. I speak French too much, but I don't know if you can. Do you understand French? Ero kamano san Onyango Midigo. So that's the French that I'm talking about, and they were here. So thank you so much, Obath Pamela. These guys, I have a lot of discussion, a lot of comments here, and some are saying next time let's bring also gender balance. So they say, wow, this is it was too much of a men feast. Yeah, we will consider that. Thank you so much, Maurice Ryan. Thank you so much, Perez. Thank you so much. Makiche. Actually, Makiche had a question here about the recolonization, whereby the Chinese, one day he was stopped in his own country before he boarded the train, and he was told by a foreigner, "Can I see your ID? Prove that you are a Kenyan."
In Kenya?
In Kenya, he was told to prove that he's a Kenyan by a Chinese when he was boarding the SGR. That's the speed gauge railway. So it's true. This is a sign of recolonization in a humble way.
Wow.
But that one will come for another day. Thank you, Mark Soro Nyasoro. Thank you, Nyakwarmodo. Thank you so much, Andrew Dunks. Thank you so much. And everyone, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson, for coming. And we're going to bring you back next time again. And actually, this is the first time we've had, the second time we've had an international show. in this diaspora TV. We normally speak French on the other way, but today we came English-wise. Thank you so much, and God bless you, and have a nice time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Kenneth and Sembo, and of course, Aboxon. Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. And anytime, just let me know, and I'll be happy to join you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice time.
Okay.
Sure. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.